Chapter 11 Autism in the summer of 1955, Bruno Bettelheim asked the Ford Foundation for $673,200 to study autism and the dynamics of early ego development. He proposed admitting to the orthogenic school up to 15 autistic children between the ages of 6 and 8 and following them for 7 years. He argued that most studies of such children had been based either on adult patients' memories of their early years or on interpretations of infant behavior based on intermittent observations in psychiatrist's offices. By treating autistic children around the clock for several years, he hoped to learn what therapy worked best to break through their armor and build their egos. He told the foundation that he also planned to study his counselors with equal intensity, the better to understand their role in the therapeutic process. Superscript 1. The use of the term autism, from autos. The Greek word for self, dates back at least to 1912, when the Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler used it to describe schizophrenic thinking divorced from both logic and reality. It was not until the mid-1940s, as Bettelheim was taking over the school, that the word came to be applied primarily to children with certain specific abnormal behavioral characteristics. This was the result of coincidental investigations by 2 Austrian psychiatrists. Hans Asperger, whose work in Vienna would remain largely unknown outside Europe for more than 4 decades, and Leo Kanner, who had emigrated to the United States in 1924. Kanner, who settled in Baltimore as director of the Children's Psychiatric Service at Johns Hopkins Hospital, first attracted wide professional attention in 1935 with the publication of Child Psychiatry, a textbook that would go through 4 editions and 14 printings by 1972. Kanner's signal contribution came in 1943, in a paper that described 11 children who had come to his clinic over several years and who, from infancy, had seemed cut off from their parents. These strange youngsters existed in their own, often impenetrable world, and Kanner was of the case that this behavior constituted a unique syndrome, which he called early infantile autism. The 3 main features that Kanner saw in his 11 patients continue to define autism today. 1. A social impairment characterized by an aloofness and lack of reciprocity. 2. A failure to communicate manifested by muteness, echolalia, or an inability to get intonations right. And 3. Repetitious, stereotype behavior, like rocking and twiddling in small children and the preoccupation with, say, railroad schedules in older ones. In the 1980s, as Asperger's research and ideas became more widely known, some clinicians extended the definition of autism to include children who could talk fluently, albeit oddly, by age 5, and who became at least superficially well-adapted and occasionally quite successful adults, though such Asperger's syndrome cases tend to remain supremely egocentric and isolated. Squared today. Both the medical and therapeutic communities agree that autism is a developmental disorder originating in genetic fault, brain insult, or brain disease. Cubed. Both Asperger and Kanner suspected that the illness might prove to have such a neurological root, but they lacked conclusive proof, and in the beginning Kanner felt that a child's psychological environment might also play an important role. His initial findings convinced him that almost all parents of autistic children were highly intelligent, self-absorbed, preoccupied with their careers, and emotionally cold, keeping their autistic children neatly in a refrigerator that did not defrost. He came to regret this chilling metaphor, because it gave rise to a persistent belief that he blamed so-called refrigerator mothers for causing autism. He never took such a hard line. In fact, in 1941 he had published In Defense of Mothers, How to Bring Up Children in Spite of the More Zealous Psychologists. Still, during the 3 decades when Bettelheim ran the orthogenic school, the belief that parents were the devils in the netherworld of autism held wide sway. Partly because of Kanner's early research, but also because parents, and especially mothers, had come to be demonized by many psychotherapists. Bettelheim told the Ford Foundation that, besides treating his autistic patients, he intended to explore what their parents had done wrong in raising them. In his grant application, Bettelheim acknowledged Leo Kanner by name, but cited none of his research, which by 1955 included at least 5 more papers on various aspects of autism, including a report on the first 100 cases he had seen. Bettelheim said he knew of no intensive longitudinal studies of children with summer of 1954 Kanner and a Johns data on 42 autistic children who had reached an average age of 14 years. Bettelheim did not specify in his proposal, the substance of which ran 7 double-spaced typewritten pages, how he planned to pursue any of the research goals he had set for himself. Nor did he offer any evidence to support his claim that he had already succeeded in helping a few autistic children in the decade he had directed the school. He did not say, as he had so many times, that he had treated one or more autistic children who had lived with him and his first wife in Vienna. But he did employ Etta the Sterba, Patsy's analyst, in his cause. In 1933, Sterba had published Ein Abnormskind in the Zeitschrift für Psychoanalytische Pädagogik. 3 years later, this 2-part monograph about a boy she called Herbert, who had come to her when he was 5 years old with a diagnosis of infantile psychosis, appeared in English under the title An Abnormal Child. Bettelheim told the Foundation that this article was the result of studies in which he had participated in Vienna, a claim for which there is no confirmation and which Gina Weinman said is not true. By manufacturing this latest credential, the former lumber dealer and student of art history now succeeded in appropriating the work and prestige of a woman whose care for Patsy, along with his former wife's, he had long ago commandeered as his own. Ford officials could have checked Bettelheim's assertion about an abnormal child by contacting Sterba in Detroit, where she had settled with her husband, Richard, after they emigrated to the United States. But few were likely to question the claims and credentials of the author of Love Is Not Enough and the just-published Truans from Life, especially after Lawrence A. Kimpton, who had succeeded Hutchins as Chancellor of the University of Chicago in 1951, told the Foundation that Bettelheim's work with disturbed children was almost unmatched in this country. In November, the Foundation sent 2 members of its advisory group on mental health to the orthogenic school. Merton Gill, a training analyst from Berkeley, California, who would become a much-honored academic psychoanalyst, and Seymour Ketty, associate director in charge of research at the National Institute of Mental Health. Ketty, who wrote the report on this site visit, found Bettelheim a charming and sagacious individual with a great capacity of human understanding which must make him an outstanding therapist. He said that the director believed that proper training based on human relationships can reverse the autistic press and bring about remarkable improvement. Ketty was convinced, on the basis of what he saw, that such gains did take place. Of what it was that persuaded him. 80 intervention autistic children either died or ended up in mental institutions. That Bettelheim had no research designed to test this hypothesis did not trouble his visitor, who felt the grant proposal's value lay in active observation and the formulation of hunches that could be tested by others. Ketty was, however, bothered by the makeup of the staff. "I would be happier," he wrote, "if there were a greater amount of scientific sophistication and rigor among them. They appear to me to be highly motivated and devoted youngsters, some of them with training in the natural sciences, but I did not perceive a carryover of scientific rigor to their own work, and I feel that much of what they see is selectively seen on the basis of their own hypotheses, or those which they absorbed from Bettelheim. For these reasons, I do not believe that this group is capable of objectively testing their own hypotheses." After stating this misgiving, Ketty urged the Foundation to make a grant. In June 1956, Ford gave Bettelheim $342,500 to be spread out over 5 years. Though the gift reduced his original request almost by half, it was a considerable boon, the equivalent of $3.75 million in 2014, to a school with some 40 children. The university announced the grant in a press release that was picked up by both the Sun-Times and the Tribune. The latter ran Bettelheim's picture. "Your success in obtaining this support, and additional substantial support from other sources, is indeed notable," Francis Chase, chairman of the Department of Education, wrote to his colleague. "It is not often that a distinguished scholar is also a gifted administrator and fundraiser. We are proud to have you as a member of the Department of Education." Superscript 1. The Ford Foundation required that Bettelheim submit annual summaries describing his progress and in July 1957 he reported that, during the grant's first 12 months, the school had examined 50 children and admitted 6 boys and 6 girls who no doubt childhood schizophrenia. Autistic type. The neatness of this gender distribution offered grounds for suspicion. Since Kanner's research had shown that autism occurred primarily in firstborn males, and that the ratio of boys to girls afflicted was about 4 to 1. Superscript 1 a disproportion that still obtains. Superscript 1 squared nonetheless. Ford accepted Bettelheim's numbers, though school records show that he had actually admitted 10 new children, 7 girls and 3 boys. Of this group, 1 9-year-old boy and 1 7-year-old girl arrived classified as autistic. Superscript 1 cubed despite that 2 years into the grant Bettelheim was lamenting to David proportion. Superscript 1 still. He told his friend that he remained quite excited about the possibility that, given enough time to work with the children, he might be able to provide a solid body of clinical evidence to support Erik Erikson's theoretical formulations about human growth and the life cycle, as expressed in his 1950 book, Childhood and Society. Bettelheim hoped that he might even be able to do for early development what Erikson had done for adolescence, and did his best to indicate that he was making at least some progress in what he called, in his 1958 report to Ford, his intensive study of 12 autistic children. In this second annual summary, Bettelheim supplied vignettes describing the behavior of several children and offered tentative clinical observations. He suggested, for example, that the dish towel twiddled by one boy offered a kind of dream scream that represented the hallucinated breast. Or, alternatively, that manipulating the towel allowed the child to pretend the megalomaniac self-sufficiency of the body and its organs. He also reported that George Perkins, the school's principal psychiatric consultant, and the anthropologist Jules Henry, had found in studying the families of autistic children that the literature on the subject needed revision. Superscript 1 he did not specify what literature, or even generalize about the direction the revision should take. Nor did he provide any details of Perkins and Henry's joint investigation, beyond quoting his colleagues as saying that the characteristic attitude of mothers was one of either towering rage against everyone and their families, or humiliation run rampant and directed mostly against the children who became autistic. As for fathers, they seemed to show uniformly an implacable paranoid distance from their wives. Where Perkins and Henry made these statements, and on what evidence, Bettelheim did not say. However genuine Bettelheim's desire to help autistic children may have been, he recognized from the start that the novelty and mystery of the disorder gave it considerable allure. Superscript 1 and that his gift for retailing case histories only augmented this glamour. To help bring his stories alive, he often illustrated them with the children's drawings. In 1952, well before the appearance of his lengthy account of Mary and Turan's from life, he had published Schizophrenic Art, a case study, in Scientific American. The magazine ran 12 of Mary's drawings, which took up more space than Bettelheim's text, and which he said depicted her march toward health. That is, picture 3 contained no people, but only a house against a dark background and was thus gloomy, whereas picture 12, which portrayed children at stand, and showed that Mary could now have fun as normal children do. Superscript 1 in 1959, in his third Ford report, Bettelheim told the tale of a 12-year-old, non-speaking autistic girl who after a decade of deepest regression, progressed from purposeless scribbling to the clear representation of faces and figures after only a few months at the school. He illustrated this extraordinary headway by interspersing 10 of her drawings throughout the report, the last one of a child made whole. Superscript 1 more drawings accompanied the 4th annual summary. These made by a child Bettelheim called Dick. They putatively demonstrated his utter autism upon entering the school and the steady improvement that followed. Superscript 1 view of Bettelheim's cases proved more riveting than Joey, a mechanical boy, which also appeared in Scientific American. Squared the magazine's editor, Gerard Peel, was Agnes Peel Crane's nephew, Patsy's cousin. But Peel would not meet the man he regarded as his relative's healer until the mid-1950s. when he came to the University of Chicago on a lecture visit and sat in on one of Bettelheim's classes in JED 126. What he did was explore all the horrendous pop ideas of why people study psychology, Peele told me. Did they think that an understanding of how human beings behave will give them more power over other human beings? The students began to get madder and demonstrated to him all the points he was making. Was there anyone in the classroom, he asked, who was interested in the sanctity and agony of the individual? It was a fabulous experience, and none of the people in that room will ever forget it. I had never seen a teacher perform like this. I felt a moral force emanating from a really great man. When Bettelheim raised the possibility of an article about Joey, Peele was receptive. It appeared in March 1959. Joey was a child who had been robbed of his humanity, Bettelheim declared in his opening paragraph. His parents had completely ignored him. His mother did not want to nurse him or take care of him in any other way. His father punished him when he cried. He was healthy at birth, but soon became frail and irritable. Once he learned to speak, he talked only to himself. At an early date he became preoccupied with machinery, including an old electric fan which he could take apart and put together again with surprising deftness. He developed compulsive defenses, which he called his preventions, and began drinking through elaborate piping systems made of straws, saying liquids had to be pumped into him. Bettelheim said that 3 months before Joey entered the orthogenic school, at age 9, by this time, he was presenting what Bettelheim called a classic example of infantile autism. Bettelheim described how Joey could eat only when his digestive system was electrified by an imaginary wire plugged into an imaginary outlet. How he often turned himself on and shifted into higher and higher gears. How much I'm called the criticizer kept him from saying words with unpleasant connotations. And how, during his first year at the school, he could defecate only while squatting on top of the toilet and touching the wall with one hand, in which he held the vacuum tubes that powered his bowels. Joey rigged his dorm bed as a kind of car machine that would live him as he slept. A photograph accompanied the article showing this complex support system, with its makeshift battery, carburetor, and wheel taped about the boy's bed. As with Mary, the magazine published several of Joey's drawings, 3 of which Bettelheim said demonstrated his growing autonomy. The first showed an unoccupied electric car, the second a similar vehicle with a passive driver, the third a figure at the wheel who had gained control of the machine. The final drawing in the text was of a tree that appears to have birds in it. The caption described this as a gentle landscape painted by Joey at age 12. After his recovery, when he had learned to express his feelings and no longer felt he was a machine. The same month that Bettelheim recounted this latest triumph, he also diagnosed some children he had never treated or even met. He said that, in the fall of 1957, William Fielding Ogburn, a professor of sociology at the University of Chicago, had sent him a manuscript about a 6-year-old Indian boy named Parashuram, whose parents claimed he had been stolen from them at 18 months by wolves. Ogburn had read about this child while in India and, after visiting him, interviewing his parents, and talking to the man who had actually found him, had concluded that Parashuram had not been raised by wolves. Since he was familiar with the work of the orthogenic school, Bettelheim wrote, he wondered if this child might be like some of the children we work with. And he invited my comments. Squared superscript 1 in March 1959, the American Journal of Sociology published Ogburn's The Wolf Boy of Agra, followed by a Bettelheim article maintaining that such children, whom the literature called feral, in fact suffered from the severest form of infantile autism. Squared Bettelheim said that as he read Ogburn's manuscript the blinders fell from eyes and led him to reinterpret the famous case of the wolf girls of Mindapur. In 1929, the Reverend J.A.L. Singh had reported finding these hideous beings. He named them Amala and Kamala. He tried to raise them at his orphanage in Mindapur, India. After reading Ogburn, Bettelheim decided that Singh's accounts of the girls' behavior were accurate enough but that his attributing it to wolf rearing was not. He likens Singh's story of finding Amala and Kamala in the lair to the wild fantasies we spun about the pasts of our autistic children when we first met them, speculation originating in our efforts to find emotionally acceptable explanations for nearly inexplicable and wholly unacceptable behavior. Bettelheim maintained that this conjecture flowed from the psychological need for explanations as well as a narcissistic unwillingness to admit that children who exhibit animal-like behavior could have pasts similar to those of normal human beings. Because of these defenses, he said, everything Singh wrote about the girl's wolf-den origins was believed. Critical voices were silenced. The mind became an unreliable instrument. Squared Cube Bettelheim now gave his readers an eye-popping tour of the orthogenic
school. His autistic patients had not been raised by wolves, he pointed out, but many of them exhibited animal-like behavior, urinating and defecating in their pants without so much as knowing it, tearing off their clothes and running about naked, screaming or howling instead of talking, insisting on raw vegetables at meals and throwing violent tantrums if denied them. Others would sulk for hours, but only from their own hands. Others build dens in dark corners or closets, sleep nowhere else, and prefer spending all day and all night there. Some build caves out of blankets, mattresses, or other suitable objects. And at least 2 of them would eat only if they could first carry their food into their self-created caves or dens, where they would then eat without using utensils. Superscript to 4. He said that some of the children, upon seeing an animal in the neighborhood, responded as though they had found the dear, long-lost friend. On spotting the dog, one girl fell on all fours and began howling like a wolf and snapping her teeth. Superscript to 5. He said most of the children bared their teeth when angry and that one counselor, unnamed, had to seek medical treatment more than a dozen times in the year because of bites by a child he called Anna. Bettelheim often dismissed requests to visit the orthogenic school by saying that he was not running a zoo. Superscript to 6. Feral children and autistic children, as his article was titled, describe a school that was a menagerie of often dangerous child beasts that most children bite occasionally, or eat with their hands at some point, brick and card tables, or bark back at dog feed. Bettelheim's theoretical advance. He wrote that, like the wolf children, psychotic children have acute sensations of smell and touch, that autistic children rely little on sight, and that schizophrenic children often behave as they were insensitive to heat and cold. Standing on this pontific foundation, he maintained that, since the wolf boys of Albert, the wolf girls of Mindatory, and other such creatures in the literature behaved so much like the autistic bipeds in his care, they must be autistic as well. His guess was that they had been emotionally, and perhaps physically, abandoned. Our own experience suggests that Akmala and Kamala were probably utterly unacceptable to their parents for one reason or another. This is characteristic of all autistic children, no matter of what age. The parents manage to disengage themselves from them by placing them in an institution, as is the usual case in the United States today, or by setting them out to fend for themselves in the wilderness, or, the most likely explanation, by not pursuing when they run away. Superscript to 7. In short, Bettelheim concluded, feral children seem to be produced not wolves behave like mothers but when mothers behave like non-humans. Superscript to 8. Along with published tales of mechanical boys and children crawling around the orthogenic school on all fours, Bettelheim made his case with film. In 1960, the Armstrong Circle Theater, the popular CBS television series, portrayed life at the orthogenic school in a nationally broadcast docudrama called The Hidden World. Superscript to actors played Dr. D and 2 of his key staff members, Florence White and Anna Lukes. The writer visited the orthogenic school while preparing the script, and Bettelheim himself coached the actress who played the deeply disturbed child on whom the story focused. The tenor of the film is typified by its ending, an exchange between a new counselor, Marty, and a resident named Andy. Marty, where are you going? Andy, home? For a week. Marty, good. Andy? Andy, I told you I'd go home someday. Marty, yes. You did. The first day I was here. Andy, Well, I know this place. That's all. It's good for everybody. Marty, I guess it is. Andy, did you hear about George Waring? Marty, I don't think so. Andy, he was here before you came. For 6 years. Now he's a junior in Michigan. And the second in his class. It's just a good place here. That's all. Even for the counselors. Was part of an optimistic progress report at a fundraising and also had hired movie makers to photograph some of the children on a regular basis. Superscript 3 Superscript 1 And in 1957 he asked the Ford Foundation to let him make this film project. The significant part of his research. Superscript 3 Superscript 2 The foundation agreed, and by early 1960 he was in New York City presenting a slide and film show for Ford officials, hoping in part that this depiction of his work would persuade them to give him additional money after the original grant expired in the summer of 1961. The films and stills shot at the orthogenic school during Bettelheim's years as director repose in his archive at the University of Chicago. It is impossible to assess them, because his estate, though it has made most of his papers available, decided that the photographic material raised questions of privacy for former residents, and closed it to researchers. One of the films in the archive is Doris, a 16mm black and white sound portrait that Bettelheim showed at the Ford Foundation and also screened in the following weeks at a Chicago Psychoanalytic Society meeting and at the American Psychoanalytic Association's annual gathering in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Stirrings of life and self-consciousness in a girl of 7 were dramatically portrayed here today by a noted psychologist, the New York Times reporter wrote after seeing the film at the APA conference. The film showed a pretty, sturdy child who Bettelheim said had been emaciated and dehydrated when she arrived at the orthogenic school, away frozen in immobility, isolation and desperation. The cause of this autistic state, Bettelheim told his audience, was the total rejection of Doris by her mother. He said that the child had come to him from a mental institution and was so passive that she had not fed herself for 4 years. Within 2 days at his school, however, she was picking up and eating raisins placed on her bedspread by her counselor. Once again he cited artwork to show progress, telling his audience that Doris initially painted only in black, covering up intricate patterns she had made, but gradually began painting in colors. Superscript 3 Superscript 3 Ford Foundation officials said they liked the films and Bettelheim's work in general, but their approval did not translate into additional funds. Superscript 3 for the foundation did accede to his compromise request to spread whatever money remained from the original grant over an additional 2 years, so he could follow his autistic children through what he said were very important steps in their development. Superscript 3.5 This extension was a mixed blessing, for Bettelheim had come to regard Ford's demand for annual reports as a burdensome nuisance and often growled that never again would he get himself into such a bind. Superscript 3.6 and would never have to if not terrified by him, not by social agencies, which were similarly cowed by his reputation and personality, and not by the University of Chicago, which over 3 decades never established a board of visitors or any other formal oversight committee to monitor Bettelheim and the orthogenic school. Bettelheim's 6th report, which ran less than 2 double-spaced pages, noted, "We made no startling new discoveries during this year. We were able to collect and consolidate further evidence to support the theoretical statements previously formulated and to refine them considerably." Superscript 3.7 6 months after the 7th and final report was due in the summer of 1963, Bettelheim apologized for being tardy in a 1-page letter. He enclosed another case history, which he hoped would do until it shall be my privilege to present you with a book-length printed report. Superscript 3.8 The Empty Fortress appeared in 1967, subtitled Infantile Autism and the Birth of the Self. It was Bettelheim's Summa Theologica on the subject, and he assured his readers at the outset that he was well qualified to lead them through the complex terrain ahead. He told them that, in the 1930s, I had living with me 1, and for a few years 2, autistic children. To make this a therapeutic experience for them, many conditions of life in our home to be adjusted to their needs. This was my initial experience with trying to create a very special environment that might undo emotional isolation in a child and build up personality. Superscript 3 having once again said that Patsy was autistic, a diagnosis that no qualified medical doctor or trained psychotherapist had made, and multiplied her by 2, Bettelheim next told his readers that the volume they held in their hands did not derive primarily from introspection but was based on the findings of trained observers. For degrees just the opposite was true, as Seymour Carey had worried in his site visit report for the Ford Foundation over a decade before. Throughout the years of the grant and beyond, Bettelheim continued to hire counselors and teachers in their early 20s or younger. At best, most of these initiates had read a psychology text or two as undergraduates and, as Carey had put it, much of what they recorded about the children was based on their own best guesses or the instruction they received from Masters Me. The school did employ professional consultants, like the psychiatrists George Perkins and Jerome Kadka, but whatever their credentials and skills, they had little or no experience with autistic children and also tended to take their cue from their employer. To further establish his expertise, Bettelheim reiterated the equation that he had first set down in 1956 in schizophrenia as a reaction in his diagnostic man for autistic children behaves because they, too, were responding to an extreme situation. They suffered from the kind of helplessness that characterized the Muslims, a camp term for those prisoners who had given up all hope. For superscript 1 the children who lacked muscle tone and shuffled about the dorms were just like the Muslims. Those who suffered from infantile marasmus and were wasting away for lack of nutrition were like prisoners who refused to eat. Those who constantly averted their gaze broke in. Mates who tried to avoid eye contact with the guards, those who twiddled and indulged in other forms of self-stimulation were akin to prisoners who constantly daydreamed. Both the children and the inmates were trying to block out an immediate, threatening reality, the SS in the camps, their mothers in the home. Bettelheim underscored this point by taking the reader into the forest with Hansel and Gretel. Some years before, his friend Rudolf Epstein, a psychologist who worked with children at the Rice Davis Child Study Center in Los Angeles, had argued that the fairy tale's rejecting mothered figure became the paranoid projection of the depowering witch. Bettelheim said this reasoning anticipated his own in The Empty Fortress, which was that the figure of the destructive mother, the depowering witch, is the creation of the child's imagination, though an imagining that has its source in reality, namely the destructive intents of the mothering person. Foursquare this passage typifies Bettelheim's own wizardry at having it both ways. Out of the smoke, the fantasy of Mom the Destroyer reappears as the real thing. Indeed, the theme found in this and other fairy tales still haunts our children today. Like Gretel, there is Martha, one of our schizophrenic girls who was convinced that her mother wanted to bake her in the oven and eat her for cubed. As in his 2 previous books about the school, Bettelheim made sure there was no shortage of such dramatic tales. The story of Joey and his preoccupation with matters mechanical now spread over 106 pages and included 20 of his drawings. The history of Doris, now called Lori, covered 58 pages. Running 78 pages was a portrait of Marcia, who Bettelheim said was mute, autistic, and unable to relate to objects when she arrived at the school at age 11. 44 in a 39-page section called The Persistence of a Myth. Bettelheim expanded on his belief that Wool children were autistic, now enlisting Shakespeare's uncanny insight to help make his case. In The Winter's Tale, Leon's, the king, cannot bring himself to kill his child and orders Antigone to do it. When the Lord pleads for the girl's life, Leonce agrees that she should not be burned to death but just set out to die. Antigone prays that wolves and bears, casting their savage held. Thus, wrote Bettelheim, makes in feral children stands the fact that some parent wishes his child to be dead. But too afraid to kill it, he exposes the child to a fate just as deadly. 45 few subjects preoccupied Bettelheim more than maternal breastfeeding, which comes up again and again in The Empty Fortress. He felt that nursing was central to an infant's ability to shape his life around his own needs, and the failure of the mother to respond properly to this demand invited psychological catastrophe, including schizophrenia and autism. Bettelheim saw evidence for this notion everywhere. He said that, just as an infant must connect to his mother's breast, so Joey had to plug himself in before he could function. He reported that Marcia liked to be in her bed with a large, lightweight ball or balloon touching her mouth, adding in a footnote that one can hardly walk down the street without seeing some child fondly handling a ball. The perfect sphere and an object often made of what was once skin. Marcia also played with a bottle that she called Lady, which Bettelheim said could be seen, with some imagination, as having breasts. When Marcia was asked why she wanted to smash the school's circular ceiling lights, she said, "Baby needs breakfast." This made no sense, Bettelheim said, until she began saying break breast instead. Break breast, he explained, is probably an idea more readily available to a baby fed from a breakable bottle than to one nursed from the breast. Quite a few of his patients thought of the light fixtures as breasts, he wrote, adding parenthetically that many felt the same way about automobile headlights. Lori was one such fond jacked in these Vienna woods, caught eternally between her overwhelming desire for the good breast, the good mother, and her despair because, in spite of all her efforts, there seemed nothing there for her, not even a bad breast, but just an empty nothing. Bettelheim conceded that this interpretation was speculative, but did not resist giving it further weight by reproducing 3 of Lori's drawings that he said probably represented breasts. 46 Many years later, a woman named Anna Williams came across Lori's drawing in the empty fortress. She, too, was autistic, but by her mere 20s had made progress so remarkable that she was able to write an autobiography, Nobody Nowhere. In it, she told of how she had drawn identical pictures over and over in her diary, a white square inside a black square, surrounded by the stark whiteness of the paper. When she saw Lori's comparable efforts at Bettelheim's bad and good breasts decoding, she laughed herself stupid. She viewed Lori's drawings as like her own, which to her represented the terrifying blackness both faced as they struggled to pass into the non-autistic world. It is impossible to prove autism, but her observation that Freudian explanation or therapist's reality then from the autistic one speaks to one of Bettelheim's persistent inconsistencies. 47 He constantly admonished his staff and students not to depend on the experts and the textbooks when trying to comprehend disturbed behavior. Instead, they should put themselves in a child's place and try to imagine what forces would make her so unhappy and act so strangely. Yet Bettelheim himself often wrote and behaved as though he had a private line to the truth. 48 And he filled the empty fortress with the kind of Freudianism represented by his breast fixation, which, to Williams, reflected the egotistical and culturally biased arrogance of much psychoanalytic thought. 4 To Bettelheim, Joey's fascination with rotating blades stood for the circle of emotion he was helplessly caught in. 5 Degrees His enthusiasm for drawing dinosaurs was typical of many psychotic children because, in addition to being dangerous and huge, dinosaurs are something that was once alive but is now dead, much as some of these children view their stools. 5 Superscript 1 For a spell, Joey frequently played a game he called Connecticut Papoose, the papoose being a person with glass around him. He was no longer a collection of wires in a glass tube but a person, though still encased and protected by glass, connected and cut off at the same time. I cut. 5 Superscript 2 Bettelheim said Marcia had an intense interest in the weather, which stemmed in part from her fear that her mother, and later the staff at the orthogenic school, intended to devour her, as in we/eat/her. 5 Superscript 3 When Marcia eventually spoke, saying uttered and then muttered, he thought the words related to nursing, but with her slurred pronunciation the word could equally well have been taken for mother or murder. 54 Bettelheim was full of this kind of language play at staff meetings as well. He was wonderful with words, recalled one counselor who was at the school in the mid-1950s and is now a therapist herself. He would talk about the psyche's punts and their meanings, and it was dazzling. But now I do this every day. It's fun, it's easy, but there's no profundity there. 55 And no insight into autism. It is exactly the capacity for the metaphorical and symbolic thinking that Bettelheim attributed to Joey and Marcia that is impaired in autistic children, whose thinking is almost always literal and concrete. Gail Schulenberger felt that Bettelheim tried to do the impossible when he began admitting autistic children. Though she left the school in 1951 after several years as head counselor, she lived in Hyde Park after marrying Bettelheim's friend and co-author, the sociologist Morris Yanowitz. and she remained close to the director and the school. She saw the autistic behavior improve month after month, trying to stop the flapping, the rocking, and the other mysterious symptoms that made these children so difficult to reach. 56. The commitment required not only long hours and less energy, but often the suspension of the middle-class instincts the young caretakers had been raised to regard as fundamental to civilized living. 4 weeks, Marcia refused to move her bowels voluntarily. When she finally began to defecate in the bathtub, her counselor, Karen Carlson, was overjoyed. 57. She had every reason to be. Such progress was rare and came only after the most exhausting dedication. Jacqueline Sanders, who was chief counselor during the years of the fourth grant, told me that Bettelheim imbued the staff with a sense of hope and esprit. Her and his other acolytes convinced that with enough hard work they could accomplish miracles. Viewed from this optimistic perspective, their effort to help the autistic children was a dismal failure. Sanders feels, in retrospect, that if the counselor's expectations had been lower, they might have been willing to settle for slow development instead of naively looking for dramatic breakthroughs. The autistic kids were the most difficult to deal with and yielded the poorest results, recalled the consulting psychiatrist Jerome Kavka. I supervised one counselor for a year in trying to get an autistic child to talk. We did not get one word. By the mid-1960s, the school's records show 58 that of them had given up on autism, largely in the view of F. Howell Wright, who cared for the children's medical needs, because the treatment became too expensive and the results were never sure. The far rosier picture emerged in The Empty Fortress. Bettelheim wrote that the autistic child had the same growth potential as the normal child. 5. That the school had restored some children, like Marcia, to full functioning in society. 6 degrees, and that he had worked with 46 autistic youngsters, all of whom showed marked improvement. 6 superscript 1. In his classes across the Midway, he often told his students of these gains. He talked of miraculous cures. There was lots of self-congratulation, recalled one of them. 6 superscript 2. The study of orthogenic school admissions and discharge records begun in the late 80s by D. Patrick Zimmerman, the school's research coordinator, shows that between the summer of 1956, when the Ford Foundation gave Bettelheim the $342,500 to study autism, and 1963, when the grant ran out, the school admitted 48 children, 6 of whom for boys and 2 girls were labeled autistic by the referent parents, social agency, or therapist. Of the 220 children who entered the school between 1944 and 1970, 13 arrived with a diagnosis of autism. 6 counselors' dictation and other material in each child's complete folder, especially the evaluations of consulting psychiatrists. It is impossible to make even an educated guess as to whether all 13 were in fact autistic. Conversely, no accurate assessment can be made of those who entered with other diagnoses, such as schizophrenia, atypical development, depression, or none given. For some of them he classified as autistic, either because Bettelheim genuinely believed they were or because he needed the numbers. We identified the autistic kids by mutual agreement, recalled Sanders, who said that the director sometimes made the kind of retrospective diagnosis. He did this with both Joey and Marcia, whose diagnoses were schizophrenia and brain damage, respectively, when they entered the orthogenic school in the 50s. 64. Thus, of the 3 children whose histories formed the vivid 242-page core of The Empty Fortress, only Lori came to the school diagnosed as autistic, a fact that did not deter Bettelheim from writing that we rarely erred in our initial evaluation of a patient. 65. Again, an independent assessment cannot be made without seeing each child's full record, but at least in the case of Joey, Bettelheim's most publicized portrait of an autistic child, the diagnosis does appear dubious. I never considered Joey an autistic child, because there was always a directness in his relationships, said Sanders, who was at the school throughout the boys' 9 years there. Bruno could speculate about the meaning of an autistic kid's behavior, but Joey told us what his fantasies were, and what they meant. That he needed motors, wires, and other mechanical gadgetry to keep himself functioning, to live. Both Bert Collar and Philip Gold, Bloom, who knew Joey as a schoolmate, said he did not seem autistic. and Patrick Zimmerman would write that a reading of Joey's history in The Empty Fortress reveals a number of autistic-like behaviors, but also raises serious doubts about whether the formal diagnosis of infantile autism should have been applied in this case at all. 66 Bettelheim's diagnostic flyers tended to be dramatic, but often that was all that distinguished them from what was going on in the rest of the field. In Psychoses of Childhood, the 1979 summary of the literature, Barbara Fish and Edward R. Revol wrote that during the years Bettelheim ran the orthogenic school, there was a spreading tendency in both Great Britain and the United States to label children autistic on the basis of inadequate criteria. One result was that researchers chose samples of profoundly retarded children who suffered primarily from organic brain disorders. Fish and Revol stressed that Leo Kanner's definition of autism in the 19th was a set of symptoms, but, as Kanner put it, autism was diluted by some to deprive it of its specificity, so that the term was used as a pseudo-diagnostic wastebasket for a variety of unrelated conditions, and a nothing but psychodynamic etiology was decreed by some as the only valid explanation. 67 During the 1950s and 1960s especially, many disturbed children, whom one would consider today to have only borderline or even no psychotic symptoms, were lumped together in an ill-defined category of childhood psychosis. 68 At the orthogenic school, this sometimes had painful consequences. Myrna Rowe was frightened and embarrassed by her schoolmates who had been identified as autistic. She and other non-autistic children spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it was that we did that made these strange kids lash out and do things like bite us. Joe Suchman was an unhappy 11-year-old who entered the orthogenic school because of troubles at home. But he soon began to fear that he might be autistic. If not, why was he living in a place that treated such children? Ronald Angries recalled that Bettelheim and the staff often suggested that the autistic children were not so different from the rest of the population. It was as if Raj had abolished the caste system at the same time that they denounced and humiliated any Indian who seemed to think he was better than an untouchable. Angries himself carried the dreaded label for most of the 12 years he attended the school, and Jacqueline Sanders used this case of a brilliant autistic boy as the core of her master's thesis at the University of Chicago in 1964. It still embarrasses me that I swallowed so easily Bruno's diagnosis of Ronald, she told me 3 decades later. He had some autistic tendencies, but he was not an autistic kid. I forgive Bruno to some degree for being so broad in his diagnoses, because everybody else was, too. However, his whole interpretation was wrong. I was young, but I really should have known better. By the time The Empty Fortress appeared in 1967, the number of professionals had begun to suspect Bettelheim's poetic interpretations 7 degrees and to complain about what one later called his often three-wheeling reflections and extravagant speculation, and his lack of circumspection when applying